wanted to thank Tanya and Eric and Benvenue House Music for giving me the opportunity to translate this poem and work a poem of my own. And it was kind of a shock to me. I met Tanya when I visited her book group a couple of years ago. And she said, "Oh, I'd love to do a collaboration sometime." I said, "Yeah, that sounds nice." And then a few years later, out of the blue, I got this call, and she said, "Can we commission you to do an original poem based on this work?" I said, "Yeah, of course." And I was, what have I done? You know, I have no idea. I don't speak German. I'm not a classical musician, but you know, an assignment is a good motivator, so I thought I would try. And sort of trying to figure out how to approach writing as a commission, as a directive. It's not usually how I work. When I work on a poem, it usually comes out of some sort of, call it inspiration. It's a line that pops into my head, it's an image, it's an idea that I've been mulling over, it's a piece of narrative, it's another piece of work. And sometimes those are, something from another piece of work is a jumping off point, but I don't feel necessarily that faithful to it. In this case, I felt like I really needed to be faithful to Schoenberg and to the poem on which Verklarte was based by Richard Demmel. And so I decided to try to recreate the conditions for inspiration, which involved doing a lot of research. So my little nerdly heart like that. I started out by just listening to a piece of music over and over again in a bunch of different versions, sextets for orchestras, and then I started reading about both Schoenberg and Demmel. And I went to the website of the Schoenberg Center. I talked to every musician I know. What do you know about this piece? You know, I really was starting from scratch. But in immersing myself in it, I started getting a sense of these relationships, which I'll talk about in a minute. And one of the things I came across was I started looking, I don't speak German, and I started looking at the translations of the poem Verklarte Nacht by Richard Demmel. And I realized that I hated them all, and that this poem must be better than this, you know. The couple of translations I found were just very clunky and seemed to me a little too literal. I mean, translation is such a dance. I've only done a little of it, but it's a dance between being faithful to the literality of the original and also being faithful to the intent, because languages are very different. I mean, English is a wonderful language to write in because it has the largest vocabulary of any living language, and of any language, period. And it has so many influences from so many different languages, and the grammar is very fluid. That's not necessarily the case with German. German has other values, and that German poetry is very much about the words in relationship to each other and working with a limited palette, but working to see what you can do with it in the same way that, say, writing in a Romance language, your word endings are all going to be very similar, for example. So it's just realizing that this was very different. I thought, well, what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to translate this poem. Well, I don't speak German, so I tracked down a PhD in German Lit, a friend of a friend of a friend, and I worked at the translation by sort of looking at a prose trot, a literal translation of the poem, and a couple of other translations that I didn't like. And I sent it to him, and I wanted feedback. And we went back and forth a couple of times, and came up with something that we were both pretty happy with. And that's what I'm going to read for you tonight. And we have a German speaker in the house. Is it Ruth? I'm sorry. Ruth is going to also read the German after I read the English, so you can really get a sense of the sound of the poem without me butchering it. So that would be very nice. So beyond that, sort of thinking about the process of translation, when I was in grad school, a lot of times I had to write papers on various poems or books of poems. And one of the things that really helped me was that sometimes I had to type out these poems as, you know, having them at the beginning of the paper to talk about them. And then in the beginning it seemed like a chore, but it ended up being really, very transformative experience. The typing or the writing out of someone else's words really gets them into your body in a way that nothing else does. And you start sort of making them your own. So I did that, and in the process started fiddling with the language and making some changes. And sort of that gave me the courage to go on. And in approaching the poem in the beginning, it was sort of interesting because, you know, it's from a very different place in time. And it's very early German modernism. The language is, at least in English translations, you know, somewhat what we might consider melodramatic. And the situation in the poem is very dramatic, and what today we might consider melodramatic. But looking at it from its place in time and trying to get into that place in time was very helpful. And as I started looking at the translation, it helped me really understand that the narrative of the poem is only sort of the structure. There's this great T.S. Eliot quote about, and I don't really agree with this, but I love it. It's that meaning is the bone that you throw to the dog while you're robbing the house. That Demel was after something else. You know, he was after the meaning, he was telling the story. But for him, he was very moved by Demel's work in general, by this poem in particular, because of this idea of this transformative something that connected us all, that he saw as an embodiment of Eros, of not just love and sex, but of the force of life in the universe. And in this poem, the light is really the image that brings that across, and that was the part of the poem that really engaged me. And I think another thing that really struck me was that Schoenberg gets a bad rap for being very left-brained, very almost mechanical, mathematical in his composition. And it is very intellectually challenging stuff, especially for those of us without a strong music background. But more and more, for him, I realized that for him, that the intellectual and emotional were so tightly linked that that was for him, this process, these sort of more intellectual processes that you see come to the forefront in his later music and the 12-tone stuff, is his means toward getting at this deep emotion. And in this poem, the reason he was so drawn to this poem was Demel's philosophical and emotional idea of this sense of transcendence and this sense of connection with everything. And I think you can listen for the images of the moonlight in this poem that really there. And one other thing that sort of struck me was, you know how when you're sort of going about your business and you're a little bit obsessed with something, that thing sort of seems to come out of the woodwork. Like, for example, you're looking to buy a new car, as a very mundane example, and suddenly you're noticing the car you're thinking about everywhere, something like that. Well, in this sense, that happens when you're writing poems too. And I have been kind of just running into this sense of this connecting transcendence everywhere, which of course it's everywhere around us. It is in our world, and especially, you know, here in the Bay Area, where we're sort of informed by Buddhist thought and by sort of alternative kind of spiritualities. This is not a radical idea, but you have to think about, and Demel's Vienna, this was a radical idea of this interconnectedness of everything. A little anecdote that my kid is obsessed with, I have a 6-year-old son who's obsessed with the TV series Avatar, which is, I don't know if you know it, it's a cartoon that's set in sort of this alternate universe medieval China. And it's absolutely great. I mean, the writers have done their homework, and that the costumes and well, it's animated, but the clothes and the settings and a lot of the language, the names of the places and so on, are very historically accurate. But it's set in this alternate universe in which, not to get into too much detail, but you know, people have supernatural powers, and those powers are according to what their tribe is. They can manipulate certain elements, and there's one kid who's born every generation who can control all these elements, and his role is to unify this community, this nation, in this sort of spiritual way. And so, Kid and I were talking about civil rights. The civil rights movement came up in the song we were hearing, and we were talking about segregation and what blacks and whites were allowed to do or not allowed to do in the South, and how blacks were discriminated against. And he said, well, what about people with, you know, with medium colored skin? And I said, well, you know, race is this sort of construct. It doesn't really make any sense, but people sort of divide, you know, people arbitrarily in some ways. And he goes, well, it's like they say on Avatar, separation is an illusion. And I'm like, okay, this is the universe telling me something. You know? Thank you. And I needed to hear that in a variety of ways. Right then, and I needed to hear it sense in a variety of ways in my own life and my own work. And that was, you know, ever since then, in the last few months, this issue of separation being an illusion and interconnectedness, which sounds like such a cliche, but is such a powerful concept, keeps coming back to me. And then here comes time to say, I'd like you to write about this poem, I'd like you to write about this piece of music. And there it is again. And so I think it was somewhat meant to be. So I'm going on a bit. I'm going to read the poem in English, Ruth will read it in German, and then I'll talk a little bit about my process in writing the original poem that was commissioned and that poem. So this is Verklarte Nacht, which is Transfigured Night by Richard Deming. Two people walk through a bare, cold wood. The moon keeps pace with them and draws their gaze. It slides across the top of the oaks. No cloud obscures its glow. The points of the boughs reach for its light. The woman speaks. I'm carrying a child and not yours. I walk in sin beside you. When I say sin, I mean the sin against myself. I lost the thread of happiness. I mean the possibility of believing in its possibility. And yet I longed for some meaning, a mother's joys and duties. And so I dared, shuddering myself into a stranger's arms, willed it and made it a blessing. But life has its ways of getting back at us. Call it revenge, so here you are. She walks, trips, makes her way onward. She looks up, the moon is still there. It sees her. It is drowning her in light. It does not stop at the sea. The man speaks. May the child you conceived be no burden on your soul. Look how the universe shines on you and on everything. We float together on a cold sea. But even now that glow moves inside you. It moves from you into me and me into you. It will transfigure the child, a child born with my light inside it. And you have brought the light into me, made me new, reborn in the glow. He wraps his arms around her full face. Their breath entwines in the cool air. They walk together into the high, bright night.
Verklarte Nacht. Zwei Menschen gehen durch kalten Hallen. Der Mond läuft mit, sie schauen hinein. Der Mond läuft über hohe Eichen. Kein Wölkchen trübt das Himmelslicht, in das die schwarzen Zacken reichen. Die Stimme ist eines Weibes schlicht. Ich trage ein Kind und nie von der. Ich gehe in Sünde neben der. Ich habe mich schwer an mir vergangen. Ich glaubte nicht mehr an ein Glück und hatte doch ein schwer Verlangen nach Lebensfrucht, nach Mutterglück und Pflicht. Da habe ich mich erfrecht, da ließ ich schaudend mein Geschlecht von einem fremden Mann umfangen und habe mich noch dafür gesegnet. Nun hat das Leben sich gerecht, nun bin ich dir, oh dir, begegnet. Sie geht mit ungelenkem Schritt, sie schaut empor, der Mond läuft mit. Ihr dunkler Blick ertrinkt in Licht, die Stimme eines Mannes spricht. Das Kind, das du empfangen hast, sei deiner Seele keine Last. O sieh, wie klar das Weltall schimmert. Es ist ein Glanz um alles her. Du treibst mit mir auf kaltem Meer, doch eine eigene Wärme flimmert von dir in mich, von mir in dich. Die wird das fremde Kind verklären. Du wirst es mir von mir gebären. Du hast den Glanz in mich gebracht. Du hast mich selbst zum Kind gemacht. Er fasst sie um die starken Hüften. Ihr Atem mischt sich in den Lüften. Zwei Menschen gehen mit hoch helle Nacht.
Loved hearing that. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Five Kinds of Light, which was the poem that Benvenue House Music commissioned. So I talked a little bit about letting my own obsessions kind of like a dowsing rod drive me, and having created this structure for just immersing myself in Schoenberg's writing, some interviews with him, a self-interview he did that was really illuminating, sort of trying to get a sense of where he was coming from and why he was drawn to this poem. Just trying to get myself stuff to bounce off of. I read, listened, explored, and started devising all these schemes. Like, okay, this is this Verklarte Nacht is a 5-part poem and kind of an A-B-A-C-A structure where there's description, speech, etc. And so I'm going to do a 5-part poem. I want it to be multivocal. I want to bring in the voices of the man and the woman and the moon and and this historical stuff and some of Schoenberg's own words, and make it this giant pastiche. And I was working on that. And strangely, that stuff kind of created a scaffold for me to make a poem that was a lot simpler. And it sort of fell away to the point where what really remained was the image of this light, this transfiguring light and this connecting light that in its own way is the music itself, and the way that music connects us and brings us together. And it sounds kind of cliche to say it that way, but I'm reading it out of the poem. And the interweaving of the music and the light. So I don't want to over-explain, I may have already, but and it's in 5 sections. I'll pause briefly. 5 kinds of light. It is ours driving up and over the heavily canted bridge, ours at night, not sleeping, ours sitting late in the office, staring into screens. We hear it stumbling along the long rows of trees, moving to drown it out, stopping just enough to step forward again into it. Ours late nights up again with a sick child, terrified and amazed, the headlights calm surveying the blinds. Ours plunking it out on the keyboard, once again from the top, despite a cascading lack of talent for whatever miracle we have been asked to perform. It is lifting and falling. It is a means of being in the world, having lost the intermediary word, body struck mute and radiant, seen. In the theaters, in the balconies of scuffed velvet, on the late-night couches, alone or together, swimming in irony or indulgence under the flickering screen. And still through it all, the title pulled. It makes a place to pour ourselves into. It has shaped ourselves. It is handed back and forth, sometimes contraband, sometimes insistent offering. And we submit ourselves to it. We feed it into our ears and our eyes. In a tangle of cables and tubes, under the overturned truck, on the riverbank, where they have given up the search, where the baseboards have been scrubbed away under so many mops, where the ice forms around the hole in the road, where in the closet, in the box, under lock and key, under duress, alone in a room in front of a window, gathered with others at the altar of our celebration, waiting on street corners and in the backs of cars, sweeping the kitchen floor, glass slipped through our fingers, on the train holding an extra ticket, in the nursery, in the departure lounge, afterwards deep in the ordinary time of strip malls and medians, kicking stones around the shore of the half-dead lake. It is broken and filtered and coming through despite what stones we pile up around our heads. It pushes us into the world with its insistent hand.